Hello all. So in today's session number 2 on chapter number 5, which is environmental issues in valuation as per IBBI syllabus, we are going to cover various important topics from theory perspective, and these topics will help us in solving the numerical or case studies which we are going to discuss in our next session, which will be last session, session number 3 in environmental issues in valuation. So in today's session, we are going to discuss various types of contaminations and their effect on the property valuation. We will further deep dive into liability of valuers, who is going to do valuation of a contaminated property, environmental stigma, restoration of contaminated land, cost associated with contamination or remediation, like cost to cure, other costs are there. These costs are important from numerical perspective also, and we also discuss the format for valuation of contaminated property. So this is just for reference. Syllabus as per IBBI syllabus of this chapter, which carries 3 marks of theory, has been just given for reference, so please go through it. So first important question is, what is a contaminated property? So when a buyer is devoid of the property rights, that is the exclusive rights, division may be partly or fully, to possess, enjoy or dispose, etc. due to contamination, the property is said to be contaminated. I repeat, when the buyer is devoid of property rights, that is, property rights are exclusive rights, and devoid could be partly or fully, to possess, enjoy or dispose, etc. due to contamination of the property is said to be contaminated. The monetary value of the contaminated property is always diminished. It is immaterial whether the diminished utility is for short period or for long period. So basically, whenever a property is contaminated, its monetary value always goes down. That reduction may be for short period or for long period. Now let us see what are the different types of environmental contaminations. So broadly, environmental contaminations can be divided into 2 major broad groups. First category is physical contamination, the other category is non-physical contamination. So 1 mark theory question can come out of this slide, so please remember these facts. So if the physical contaminant or contaminants is present on the property or near the property, and the contaminant can be measured at quantity. So these are the key 2 facts, key 2 terms, that contaminant can be present on the property or near the property, and it should be measured in quantities. The property is said to have physically contaminated. The physical contaminants also include hazardous substances, that is ignitable, corrosive, toxic or reactive. Example of physical contaminants are asbestos, heavy metal like lead, mercury, or mining products like arsenic, cyanide, pesticide, etc., or organic compound like formaldehyde, coal tar, etc. So other category is non-physical contamination. So contaminants that have no tangible physical substance are called non-physical contaminants. For example, proximity to noise sources, electromagnetic radiation caused by near power line of mobile tower, etc. So if I have a mobile tower on top of my building, so we can say the property is contaminated. Next question is, what is a contaminated site? So as per Contaminated Site Management Working Group of Treasury Board of Canada Secretariat, a contaminated site is defined as a site at which contaminated substance occur at concentration above past level and likely to cause an immediate or long-term hazard to human health or to the environment, and exceeds level specified in policies and or regulation. So this definition, you please remember, 1 mark theory question can come out of this slide. So this is the classification of contaminated sites as per the working group. So the Canada has further developed a NCSCS 2003 system, and the full form is of this NCSCS is National Classification System for Contaminated Sites, to classify the contaminated sites basis their current and potential adverse impact as under. So please remember full form of this short form, NCSCS. So what are the 5 types of contaminated sites? Class 1, which is also called high priority for action. So as per available information, an action is required to address the existing concerns for public health and safety. So in case of class 1, which is also defined as high priority for action, action is required. So keyword is action is required from examination perspective. Then second category is called class 2, and it is also known as medium priority for action. As per available information, there is a high potential for adverse impact due to off-site migration. However, threat to human health and environment is generally not likely. So here action is likely required. In class 1, action was must. Here in class 2, action is likely required. Then third category is class 3, low priority for action. As per available information, the site is currently not of high concern. However, additional investigation may be required out to confirm the site classification and some degree of action. So here the action may be required. So this is the difference between class 1, 2 and 3. Please remember from exam perspective. Then the fourth class is called class N, not a priority for action. So as per available information, the site has no adverse impact on environment or human health, thus no action is required. So N, please remember it from N, that no action is required unless new information becomes available indicating greater concerns when the site be re-examined. So either you do the re-examination of the site, collect some fresh information, and based on that you may change your classification. But if whatever information is available, based on that no action is required, and it has to be categorized as class N. And the last category of contaminated site is class I or INS, or also called insufficient information. Some initial site assessment has been done, but the information available is insufficient to classify the site, thus additional information is required. So what is the liability of a valuer? So a valuer is unlikely to have knowledge or skill to undertake an environmental audit of a property under valuation. This we have already understood in last session also, but here we will deep dive into it. However, the valuer or client may appoint a suitable environmental expert. Please note that in all cases, valuer must have primary knowledge of quality of data of the property and its proposed temporary permanent use. If no environmental expert is appointed, the valuer may appoint following standard clause in his valuation to safeguard his interest in future. So it is given under quote, we have neither made any attempt nor arranged for any investigation to be carried out to determine whether or not any deleterious or hazardous material has been used in the construction of this property, and we are therefore unable to report that the property is free from risk in this respect. For the purpose of this evaluation, we have assumed that such investigation would not disclose the presence of any such material to any significant extent. So these are the general effects of contaminated properties on valuation. There are multiple effects. So if property gets contaminated, following are the general effects that could affect valuation of a property. So first major effect is falling demand. So demand for contaminated property falls if non-contaminated property is available for sale in the market. So if we have 10 properties in a locality, in a society, and they are properties which are not contaminated, so property which is contaminated will have less demand. People will not tend to buy contaminated property if they have availability of non-contaminated property in the area. Fall in price, because demand is less, so price will also decrease. So the buyer may demand discount on account of contamination. fall in demand and fall in price of property is due to stigma. So stigma is intangible factor. We have also gone through the stigma concept in last session also. We will also further deep dive into in the current session. So stigma is an intangible factor and it may not be measurable in terms of redemption, remediation cost or cost to cure, but certainly affect the market value. The discount demanded may or may not be in proportion to the level of contamination. Third general effect is assets of the market. Some companies, in absence of the market data on contaminated assets, believe that the assets would not be sold at any price, and such companies keep the assets of the market. So if I am owner of a company and I feel that this is a contaminated property, so it will not have a good market, so I may not tend to sell their property. So valuers normally find it very difficult to collect the data about contamination and analyze them from valuation purpose. So valuer also avoid to do valuation of such properties. Then there is a risk of lawsuit. It is also in fact. So contaminated assets may create contingent liabilities associated with lawsuits for sellers as well as valuers. So if a seller is selling a property or valuer is valuing the property, there is always a risk of lawsuit against them. If the subject property has used any hazardous material in construction and the valuer fails to consider it while preparing the valuation report, there are chances that litigation may take place on account of carelessness of the valuer. Also, litigation may also take place against the seller, as it may be difficult to prove the innocence of the seller or the valuer as regard to knowledge of the presence of the contaminant in the property. Thus, both sellers and valuer may refrain from selling, and valuer may avoid doing valuation of such contaminated properties. Reduced market value, that is another effect of contamination of a property. Once contaminated, the property value remain in less demand even though restoration is done. So even though contamination has been removed from the property, the demand will not reach to the normal level. This creates a situation similar to obsolescence. So if the property owner makes no attempt to overcome the stigma and thereby accepts a lower price of the property, the price may not accurately reflect market value. Then next effect is difficulty in getting finance. It is difficult to mortgage and get finance on contaminated properties, especially when the property is known to be contaminated. So if a property is contaminated because of any reason and it is known to the market and lender also get to know, so lender will avoid taking mortgage of those properties because of lower marketability of those properties. Difficulty in getting funds for remediation. So if I want to arrange, if I don't have funds to do remediation of the property and I approach to a bank or financial institution for giving some loan to me for doing remediation of the contaminated property, so obviously lender will avoid first. But even if lender will give me some loan, so lender will may charge higher ROI to overcome the risk. Environmental stigma. So what is it? Environmental stigma is defined as loss in value of the property due to its bad reputation on account of the contamination. So once the property is contaminated and it is known to the market, then demand will fall, price will decrease. So there is a market reputation of the property and it will be bad reputation of the property in the market. Thus value of the contaminated property ultimately depends not only on the extent of contamination but also the way in which contamination is perceived by the market. So what is the level of contamination property actually has? It is one factor obviously, but how market perceives that contamination, what is the market perception toward that contamination in the property, that is more important, which decides the stigma loss, a loss due to stigma, environmental stigma of the property. So environmental stigma is an intangible and cannot be quantified. Market can impose environmental stigma on following type of properties. 1 mark theory question can come out of these slides. So environmentally contaminated properties, these properties are absolutely contaminated and market is not in a position to hide the fact. So the first category of environmental stigma could be property is contaminated and everybody in the market knows that property is contaminated. Environmentally suspected properties, these properties are suspected to be contaminated and confirmatory reports are not available. So people have a doubt that this property is contaminated or not. So there is no concrete report and information available in the market to support the assumption. of contamination, non-contamination. So these properties contribute stigma on account of following reasons: risk of remediation cost, which is unknown. People think that if it is contaminated, I may need to require some extra cost for remediation of the property. Then trouble factor, trouble in remedying the property, remediation of the property, and selling the property, buying the property, taking loan from the bank. Fear of future lawsuit, which may happen. And then lack of sellability and marketability of the property because of low demand. Environmentally remediated property. So this is the third category of environmental stigma property. So these are the properties once known to be contaminated and now free from contamination due to completion of remediation work. So these properties were earlier contaminated, but owner or some company has done remediation work of the property and the work has been completed. So these properties get stigma due to following reasons. Still, even after full remediation, the property still has some type of stigma. So risk about its absolute remediation, risk of additional cleanup in future, some extra cleanup may be required, and market may perceive, may think that whether the property is absolutely remediated or not, and risk of unexpected perception. So these are the perception and risk which are involved with the property, because of which market still after full remediation do not tend to give full market value of the property. And the fourth type of stigma is that environmentally adjacent or proximate properties. So these are the never contaminated properties which locate near to a contaminated property or a hazardous waste. Such properties, however, can only be determined by people's perception and cannot be generalized. So even if my property is not contaminated, but my adjoining adjacent property is contaminated, it again have some effect on my property value, and people may tend to have some negative perception about my property also. So these are the measures to restore contaminated land to the baseline condition. So baseline condition means that the status prior to damage of the property. So before contamination of the property, what was the actual status? So that is called baseline condition. So they are following methods of restoration. This is also an important slide out of which 1 mark theory question can come. So first type of restoration is primary remediation. So it includes measures like removing of substance or structure causing contamination from the land. It also includes other measures like plantation, stocking, example fish, restriction of use of the area, etc. If the land is allowed to recover through its own process, it is called natural recovery, which is another form of primary remediation. So please remember that natural recovery is another form of primary remediation, and removing of substance or structure from the land causing contamination is fall under category of primary remediation. Then second type of remediation is complementary remediation. If the land doesn't get fully restored to the baseline condition through primary remediation, it may be required to add similar level of natural resources to bring the contaminated land to baseline condition. So after implementing this first method, if the land is not able to reach to the baseline condition, then we may be required to add some extra natural resources to make that land to the previous level. So that process is called complementary remediation. And third type of remediation is compensatory remediation. Here primary and complementary remediation methods take some time to get the contaminated land fully restored to the baseline condition. So thus certain measures are required to be taken during the interim period. So both these methods, primary and complementary method, take their own time to restore the land to the baseline condition. So if we want immediate solution, immediate recovery or immediate restoration, then we go ahead with the methods of compensatory remediation. So what are the different costs associated with contamination and remediation? So first important cost is cost to cure. Please remember all these terminologies. 1 mark straightforward theory question can come, and otherwise in numerical these terminologies will come. So cost to cure, this is the total cost of either controlling the contamination or repairing the contaminated part of the property. So I repeat, total cost of either controlling the contamination or repairing the contaminated part of the property. Cost to control, it is the total cost of controlling the contamination. Keywords are cost of controlling the contamination in the property, then cost of public liability. Depending on the dose and duration of the toxic contamination, it may lead to public liability if public is affected at large. For example, release of toxic gases in surrounding environment. Public liability lead to loss in property value because of following two reasons. So the owner has to pay the cost related to the release of toxic contaminants into the surrounding properties, and owner may have to defend lawsuit associated with the contaminant. Best example of this cost to public is Bhopal gas tragedy case. And next, another type of cost associated with the contamination remediation is cost to disruption. It is the cost of disturbance experienced during remediation process and includes. So when we do remediation of the property, during that process, the cost of disturbing the property, removal of contaminant from the subject property, so we have to incur certain cost to remove the contaminant from the property, then disposal of contaminant to safer location like landfill sites. We cannot dispose of that contaminant from anywhere, so there's we have to dispose of that under the ground, very under the ground, far away from the main city. Renovating the part of the properties, renovation cost may be required, and displacement of occupant tenant if any, and bringing other tenants. So if renovation or remediation is being carried out on the property, so for during that construction or repair renovation time period, so we have to ask our tenants to vacate the property. There will be loss in rental value, and after property will be remediated, then we have to bring in new tenants. We may be required to pay some brokerage to the property dealers also. So there is a cost associated with bringing back the new tenants. So it is difficult to estimate cost of disruption. We may, however, estimate the profit from a property before disruption and after disruption. And another cost is cost to utility. It is defined as utility of the property that will increase in future. This cost is pertaining to non-use of the contaminated property till remediation plans are sanctioned by competent authorities. So in case of cost to disruption, it was after commencement of the work. So let us see, it is, and this cost to utility is also called deferred utility. This cost to utility is different from cost of disruption, because cost of utility arise due to non-use of contaminated property before remediation. So please note down this hairline thin difference between cost to utility and cost to disruption. So cost to utility arise due to non-use of property, contaminated property before remediation. However, cost of disruption is associated with the non-use of the property during remediation. So cost of utility is before remediation or before sanction of the plan, remediation plan, and cost of disruption is after sanction of the plan and during the remediation process of the property. Another cost is cost to operation. So it is the extra cost required to operate the contaminated property. Some extra supervisory personnel, additional testing may be required. Likewise, special insurance of the property during remediation process may be required. Thus, contaminated properties may have higher operation and maintenance cost. Even if the property is remediated, remediation work has been done, so still we may be required to have extra monitoring, extra care. We may be required to have extra personnel to take care of the property. So that extra cost is called cost to operation, that enhances the cost of operation of the remediated properties. Reduced revenue. If market is unaware of contamination of the property, it may earn equivalent gross rent, however end up getting less rent due to higher operational and maintenance cost. If market is known of the contamination, until the time building gets its permit from the competent authority, the tenant may feel that the property is lightly contaminated. During this period, it may be difficult to attract tenants, causing reduced gross rent. So there are two scenarios. If market is known about the contamination in my property, then I may be able to earn equivalent gross rent from the market, but because of higher operational costs and cost to operation and maintenance costs, my net rent will be reduced. Net revenue, net annual rent will be lower because of higher operating cost. If market is known of the contamination, then I will not get annual gross rent equivalent to the other non-contaminated properties in the market. So next is what is the format for doing valuation of the contaminated properties. So Wealth Tax Act 1957 prescribes various valuation formats depending on the purpose. However, a concise format for valuation report on contaminated asset is not prescribed by any authority. So 1 mark theory question may come out of it. Please remember, there is no specific format. Following are the indicative ingredients that may be included in the report of the contaminated properties. So basic information of the contaminated property like address, detail of the environmental agencies including qualification of environmental professional. So these details you should add. Then introduction of valuer and environmental agencies. So summary of terms and conditions under which the valuer has assigned the job to environmental agency and methodology used for environmental site assessment. So these details should be included in head of the introduction of the valuation report. Then other major elements to be incorporated in the valuation report are detailed site description and records which have been studied by the environmental engineer and valuer. Then interview and environmental site preliminary survey. These details should be incorporated. Then quantity of contaminants. What is the quantity of contaminants has been presumed to be present in the property? What are the legal requirements? Abatement technologies, that is methods that has the potential to reduce the public exposure. So findings of valuation process, conclusion and declaration. So this is an indicative format. However, there is no standard format in any statute. So that's all in today's session. So before I'll tell you what we are going to have in our next session, I would request you to please subscribe to this channel if you are not done till now, and please click on bell icon so that you will be notified immediately after I upload the next session. So in next session, we are going to discuss examples and case studies on impaired value, unimpaired value, property value diminution, remediation cost calculation, and case studies on valuation of contaminant properties through 3 different approaches which we have already covered in previous series of sessions: market approach, cost approach, and income approach. So we will see number of examples and case studies, and 12 marks theory or numerical or case study may come out of next session. Thank you.